Right, let's get going. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on contaminated land and historic mapping. Thank you for giving me your time today, and hopefully in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to share with you some of the more important aspects of contaminated land, and we'll take a closer look at historic mapping and the significance it has on environmental matters. A copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar can be made available to you after the webinar, so please don't hesitate to ask. You should see a panel on the screen which allows you to ask written questions, so feel free to submit any questions as we go, and I'll try and have them answered for you by the end of the webinar, if not after. If you're using a Windows PC or Mac, you should see that there's some product cards visible for you to download. If you just click on that, the files should start downloading automatically. There will be a short feedback survey at the end of the webinar, and we're always looking at ways of improving our presentations, so I would really appreciate it if you could take a few seconds to fill that out. So let's begin. Here's our agenda for today. Historic mapping is key in identifying historic environmental risks such as sources of contamination, as well as risks from mining activities, and tell us a great deal about how land was used or managed historically. They are therefore an invaluable record of the past, and in the UK we're really lucky to have been at the forefront of mapping development in the 1800s, therefore capturing a great deal of the Industrial Revolution, which leaves us with a contaminative legacy to clean up. It was only as recent as 1974, with the Control of Pollution Act, that waste management practices really started to evolve, following Part 2A of the EPA 1990. So today I'm going to start by briefly introducing the source pathway receptor conceptual model, and then we'll look at some mapping with a little journey through time, which will demonstrate on how important mapping is in the identification of modern day risks. We're also going to look at some of the wartime secrets that maps hide, and I'll show you how Groundshare have overcome some of these obstacles. We will also very briefly run over Part 2A of the EPA, the guidance and the Law Society practice notes on contaminated land, and what the next steps are if a report comes back in need of further assessment. And finally, we'll finish with a few case studies and examples of contaminated land from across the Southeast, and also the environmental report options. So under Part 2A of the EPA 1990, in order for a property or a piece of land to be designated as contaminated land, there must be a source pathway receptor linkage. Now, the source is the cause of the contamination. This can be anything from old landfills producing leachate and landfill gas to petrol stations with a leaking underground storage tank to an engineering or gas works. The pathway is the route by which the receptor is or might be affected by a contaminant. This could be through ingestion of soil or dermal contact or something like inhalation. And the receptor is something that could be adversely affected by a contaminant. For example, a person, an organism, ecosystem, or property or controlled waters. So there are plenty of various examples and how they can be linked. So here's a little diagram that I thought to include to sort of help visualize the pathways, the contaminants, and the receptors for you. So in producing our assessment of risk, we use a combination of regulator data, other third-party data, and a number of data sets which are unique to Groundshare and not available elsewhere. With regards to third-party data, we manage data from over 130 third-party organizations such as the Environment Agency, the Coal Authority, Public Health England, BGS, and GABA Risk Management. Third-party data consists of things like permits to discharge a range of substances to the environment, to keep or use certain substances, i.e. like radioactive materials or chemicals, Part 2A land. To identify historic contamination, we use a number of data sets and a combination of our data sets in addition to third-party data sets, plus our environmental consultant's professional opinion. Now, ensuring that we take into account different types of data sets when it comes to contaminated land is crucial in being able to paint a more complete picture and be able to assess risk as quickly and accurately as possible. In particular, our GroundShare historical land use database is an unrivaled data asset in terms of the level of detail and insight it provides, with over 27,000 individual land use classifications across the UK, and with mapping data that goes back as far as 1842. The significance of this becomes clear when considering that most residential environmental searches use risk algorithms and that this historical land use data is fundamental to how risk algorithms operate. So the example that you can see on the screen, this site's actually an old disused railway site with its various depots, warehouses, tanks, and other features on this site. Now, typically a site like this, you would draw, or other companies would actually draw a polygon around the whole site and list it as a disused railway station. But what we actually do is a little bit different. We actually highlight and draw a polygon around every single feature on that site, as you can see that we've done here. That's why we actually have over 27,000 individual land uses. We highlight each of those features, draw a polygon around them, classify them, and then risk rank them, which therefore gives you much more granularity when it comes to data, and it gives us a lot more accurate outcomes when we're actually writing the reports up for you. We're able to turn reports around much faster this way and able to provide much more clarity in terms of what the verdict is. We have actually painstakingly collated unique data sets such as Part 2A sites, infilled land, historic tanks, energy features, garages, military sites, and petrol stations, which nobody else has done. And hopefully in the body of this presentation, you'll get to know some of those data sets a little bit better. So we use Ordnance Survey 6-inch to the mile mapping, which is mapping that's more detailed. And we also use 25-inch to the mile to allow specific features of concern to be seen more clearly in urban areas, as well as a greater detail for building and railways, as you can see here. The Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps record most man-made and natural features in the landscape and represent the first comprehensive survey of all of England and Wales at a consistent scale and specification. We use mapping going back as far as circa 1842, so that's OS Map Edition 1. And this is when mapping became sufficiently credible, consistent, and accurate. It also marks the starting point whereby the whole country was initially surveyed between 1842 and 1893. It's actually said that every road, railway, field, fence, wall, stream, and building is shown, and even smaller features such as letterboxes, bollards, or quaysides, mileposts, and flagstaffs. Within the mapping, uncultivated land is distinguished by different symbols for marsh, bog, and rough grassland, types of woodland, and types of woodland are distinguished as well. You've also got parks, ornamental grounds, and orchards. All public boundaries and administrative boundaries are clearly shown apart from certain boundaries within towns. So here's the exact same location using the more detailed 25-inch to the mile mapping. As you can see, this allows specific features of concern to be seen more clearly in urban areas, as well as a greater detail for buildings and railways. So that's in 1938. Again, here's the same area in 1960. The engineering works is now called a works, and that's actually due to Cold War era mapping. Things which are nationally important or strategic have actually been generalized in this particular one. So raw manufacturing, any metal, oil, or fuels, potentially big targets would have been generalized. And I thought it would be really interesting to go through a bit of a mapping epoch so you can see the evolution of the same area over time. So here on this screen is the location of a certain famous football ground as surveyed in a high detail 25-inch to the mile map back in the 1880s. So we'll whiz through the next few decades so that you see how the area evolves. And you can kind of also see the various layers that you would see when you're assessing an area. They're all digitized. Our teams have access to various digitized layers. You can turn boundary lines on and off, and you can get a really good sense of how the area actually grows. So this is in the 1880s. The same area in the 1900s. A little bit more detail there. Then the 1910s, new things start to pop up. And then the big change, the 1950s. It's now a county football ground with lots of new buildings and works that have cropped up and warehouses. Then you've got the 1960s, which starts to fall into Cold War era mapping. Then the 80s. And here, the 90s. Another really important aspect of mapping is the digitization quality of the maps that we use. We scanned our mapping much more recently, allowing us to benefit from higher resolution scanning technology. So you can see in this example on the screen with the image on the right, showing the higher resolutions map digitized, which is what we benefit from, versus the one on the left, which is 300 dpi or dots per inch, which is what the industry standard is. If we were writing a report using the map on the left for a modern day property, which used to be occupied by the warehouse, we wouldn't be able to read warehouse, and we would associate the building with a sheet metal works and thus identify a significant risk. Whereas the imagery on the right is the higher resolution mapping which we use. We would read warehouse and realize this often is where finished or dried goods are stored and actually not identify a significant risk. Essentially, the greater level of detail results in more accurate outcomes, which can have a significant bearing on the number of reports needing further review by the environmental consultants, and hence can reduce the times needed to turn the reports around. So now let's have a look at some wartime mapping secrets. It's one of my favorite topics. Now this particular area is in Risley and Warrington. So in 1927, Stanley Baldwin said, "No work of defense shall appear on any map on sale to the general public. No blank space shall appear, but the natural physical features of the country shall continue to appear." And some of the attempts to hide these features were more successful than others during the war. Now, distinctive features would have included, would have actually been either left unlabeled. Sometimes something would be called a depot. Anything with a very regimented layout would sort of be blanked out. You could also sort of see big, large swathes of area that were empty, and those were, again, due to the wartime. A really, really good example are these on the left. So this is the maps from the Chatham Docks down in Kent. And so the image that you see on the left is from 1933 with a great level of detail, buildings, names being identified. In the middle, you're looking at a map from 1938, and stuff slowly starts to disappear. And the level of detail becomes far less apparent. And the map on the right is from 1955, where it just turns into a giant white blank space with virtually nothing there. Usually when you come across maps with big giant white spaces, it's always a sign to go either before or after the 1950s to see what was there previously. Here's a little bit of a closer look again at the Chatham Docks. So on the left is an image from the 1930s. As you can see, there's labels and names, and it signifies a basin. And the image on the right is from the 1950s. So part of the docks are actually removed or have been removed between the 1930s and the 1950s. Here again, still on the Chatham docks, the image on the right, now you see residential properties that have actually been built on the former site and in color. So you can see a major change in the use and evolution of the area. Now it's always really interesting to see what the effects of war are. Now if you look out for ruins after the war, as you can see on this image on the right, same area, but the image on the right has ruins written on it. That actually implies bomb damage and possible need for an unexploded ordnance assessment or survey due to possible bombs still being in the area. Now this mapping was taken from the center of London. So again, to the left we have an image captured, and it was actually from 1919, and to the right we have the image from 1953. So all of those labels that say ruin indicates that this area has been affected by World War II bombing and that there may have been a possibility that UXOs may be present. So during the Cold War, usually between 1945 to 1991-ish, specific names, roles of factories were removed from mappings on the order of MI5 in case they were useful to the enemy. These regulations were then relaxed in 1964 to an extent, but maps, when the Cold War rule was put in, became a lot less interesting because everything just turned into a lot of blank space. And we can't really overlook the importance of military data or military sites when it comes to mapping. The historic military or ordnance feature database that we have was produced following research of military records with features judged to be of contaminative concern, and were digitized using available mapping technology. As I've mentioned before, a lot of these features were not present on mapping for security reasons. So the image on the left we have is Melchburn Park, Risley in Bedfordshire. During World War II, Risley was used as the USAAF as a base to store and fill bombs, which were then forwarded to the local American air bases. So it was a forward filling station, and it was set up in the woods at the top of the carriage drive where bombs were filled with gas. Now, the last remaining containers of gas were removed in the 1970s. However, remnants of deadly mustard agent and its breakdown products still remain in parts of Coppice Wood near Risley, in an area which is currently fenced off and surrounded by warning signs about toxic chemicals. This mustard gas was meant to have been removed in 1988 and then again in 1998, but some of it actually still remains in that wood. Now the image on the right, we have the location of ROF Chorley, which was a World War II munitions factory. At its height in the World War, it employed some 35,000 people manufacturing a wide range of munitions for the armed services. In May 1943, workers on the 928-acre site filled 19 bouncing bombs for the famous Dam Buster raid on the German dams in the Ruhr Valley. It's really, really quite fascinating, so I highly recommend you have a look at ROF Chorley on Google for some further information. Another feature sometimes left on labels on maps are garages, and for this reason we have built a database on these sites, which are also sometimes linked to Part B permits for petrol. With modern garages, you will often see a sloping forecourt to a drainage point close to 3 manhole covers in a line. These are known as interceptors and essentially filter spilt fuel and oil. Older petrol stations do not have these control measures, and many of these sites have been decommissioned, making them prime redevelopment sites. Now, when they used to decommission these sites, it was relatively common for a member of the local authority fire department to inspect the tanks and confirm that they'd been encapsulated or sealed or filled with sand or concrete and then left in situ. Therefore, many of these sites have old redundant tanks lying in the ground, and identifying the location of such features is a direct benefit to a developer or a landowner. We're the only environmental provider who offer this set of data in our reports. Others just assume a land use is there based on certain features, such as a labeled tank, whereas we know for definite what the land was used for. For example, whether it was a garage, such or an MOT or petrol station, it makes the assessment a lot more accurate and not based on certain assumptions. Now, the UK's expertise in land remediation has been born out of necessity. As the first industrialized country in the world, the UK has over 400,000 hectares of contaminated land, much of it a legacy of the Industrial Revolution. However, research undertaken by Groundshare using our unique historic mapping data has revealed that around 619,000 hectares was formerly covered by a wide range of industrial sites. This equates to around 4% of the land in England and Wales. This was based on analyzing our historic land use database, which consists of the previously mentioned 27,000 potentially contaminative land use types. Just 0.007% of England and Wales landmass is officially designated as contaminated land as set out in Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act. The Groundshare research suggests that there is a significant potential for more contaminated land sites to be identified based on the variance in brownfield land estimation. Let's have a quick look at current legislation and guidance. So the primary legislation in the UK concerning contaminated land is Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act 1990. It legally defines contaminated land as land where substances could cause significant harm or where there is a significant possibility of harm being caused to people or protected species, or where there is significant pollution of controlled waters being or likely to be caused. In essence, the legislation places a duty on all local authorities to suitably identify and prioritize sites in their area for inspection and investigation. Part 2A provides a means of identifying and remediating land that poses a significant risk to health or the environment, where there is no alternative solution. It also works alongside planning rules to help ensure that this land is made suitable for use following redevelopment. Another really important part of this is the Class A, Class B person distinction. So under Part 2A, there are two types of responsible parties with regards to contaminated land. So you have the Class A and the Class B person. So a Class A person is someone who has caused the contamination or knowingly permitted contamination to occur. However, the problem in the UK is that due to the age of our historic industrial revolution and legacy, the polluter can't always be traced. So therefore, the polluter pays principle doesn't always apply. The UK is arguably the birthplace of industry, and during the Industrial Revolution, there was effectively no regulation of process and chemicals and disposal of waste, bearing in mind that this was a time of large-scale raw industrial processes. So it was not uncommon to simply bury waste on site. And indeed, we often see this on old historic maps with markings indicating embankments, groundworks, tips, or refuse heaps. Coincidentally, these tend to appear in close proximity to industrial areas. And in some instances, you can actually see the tracks from the factory to the dumping ground. Nowadays, of course, there's lots of different pieces of legislation and systems designed to regulate and control hazardous practices and substances. So where a Class A person cannot be identified, it is usually the current owner or the occupier of the land who bears the liability for the cost of any remedial works necessary. This is known as the Class B person. What's more, is a Class B person can actually become a Class A person if they're aware of the issue but take no action. So it is really possible to inherit the responsibility for historic contamination when buying land. It is therefore very important to conduct due diligence and protect yourself and your clients from any potential backlash. Now, the presence of contamination does not mean that there is immediate legal liability for remediation via statutory designation. However, some increased risk of such liability should be considered alongside the far more common and very real risk of abnormal developmental costs associated with remediation that may be required for redevelopment, home extensions, or similar projects. So back in 2001, in response to Part 2A, the Law Society issued a warning card on contaminated land. And it basically states that in every transaction, the issue of contaminated land should be considered. This was then, however, in December 2014, replaced with a practice note. In essence, the content is pretty much the same, but much more detailed, because it now includes terminology which actually refers to environmental searches. In addition to that, you've got the National Planning Policy Framework. So one of the core principles of the NPPF is to encourage effective use of land by reusing land that has been previously developed, provided that it is not of high value. So it is fairly common for the majority of contaminated land to be addressed through planning, and many local authorities are now inserting contaminated land conditions into planning permissions. So it would be silly not to talk about funding. In 2013, DEFRA announced that they would be axing the Contaminated Land Capital Grants. So that's the fund that's used for investigating and remediating contaminated sites. DEFRA stated that the decision to axe the funding was regrettable but necessary. So indeed, the situation is made worse now with DEFRA withdrawing all funding under its Contaminated Land Capital Grant Program. Statistics have shown that between 2011-2012 and 2014-2015, local authorities made 250 applications for a total funding request of $30.7 million from DEFRA. Unfortunately, only 31% received the funds required, whilst the funding gap of $21 million was left for councils to contemplate on how their efforts would be financed. Without the necessary funding, local authorities are left in a position where they can no longer exercise their statutory duties under Part 2A. And this is certainly a view which is mirrored by David Rutland, Chair of the Environmental Protection UK. Rutland actually stated that with no alternative source of funds, councils are not very keen to go looking for contamination in case they find it. He went on to state that to prove the existence of contaminated land, there needs to be investment in the investigation and testing process. Most of the officers that he was in touch with report no budget to do this. So what does this actually really mean for property purchasers? The two biggest implications mean that it could lead to more human health hazards and more blighted properties. Now, the average cost of cleaning up contaminated land is a whopping £250,000 per acre, meaning making right the average contaminated plot in the UK would cost approximately £15,000. It's basically money that nobody has. Many home buyers, especially those making their first purchases, have limited equity in their properties and so cannot borrow to cover the cost of cleanup work. Being hit with a £15,000 an additional £15,000 of costs for a new house could financially be catastrophic. And for those with plots larger than the UK average of 243 square meters, the expenses could become even more unmanageable. So with each of our reports, grantor provide a professional opinion which either results in a pass or in need of further assessment. So pass means we don't consider there to be a high potential risk and the property will be designated as a contaminated land. Typically, if there's a big green tick on the front page, nobody gets past the front page. If a report comes back in need of further assessment, that doesn't always mean that the property is blighted. It just means that we need further information to clarify the risk to ensure it's not contaminated, as our data indicates that there could be possible contamination. So there is no need to panic if something comes back in need of further assessment. When the report's results are in need of further assessment, we do provide a set of recommendations, which, if sufficient, can then enable for us to revise the report to a pass. And we do offer this service free of charge. So the recommendations are typically found on page 3 or 4 of the report, but I will summarize what those next steps are here. Typically, we would either ask for the NHBC certificate. It's usually for policies after 1999, and they must include contaminated land cover. You could also go via planning conditions, which are more standard after 1985, but must include conditions relating to contaminated land as well. The other alternative or next step would be to approach the Environmental Health Department, and being able to ask them the right questions is really key in order to get the answers we need to change it to a pass. And the last and sort of final step that we would recommend is insurance, which, to be honest, most people don't tend to go for. But you can obtain insurance via granture through building and land guarantees. So I mentioned earlier about approaching the Environmental Health Department and figuring out which questions to ask. So the kind of logical flow of how you would go about looking at the next steps would be looking at the key points. So cross-reference your other documents to find the quickest and easiest solution. So the first question to ask is, how old is the property? Because this can help identify if planning could be used. So mainly for properties after 1985, but more common in recent years. Now, if it's a new build, it'll more than likely have an NHBC policy or certificate or have been remediated under planning. If you have to go to the Environmental Health Department, then knowing the right questions to ask is really, really key. So, key questions that we would encourage you to ask them would be, are the council aware of the former land use of the site? Does the council have any intention with regards to Part 2A? So do they intend to investigate the site? What is the priority level of this site? Is it high, medium, low? And how many sites do they actually have on the inspection list? And how long do they think it will take to investigate all prior sites? So this is a little diagram of the routes that you could take if a report comes back in need of further assessment. Hopefully you're able to see that clearly. Now, when do you get insurance? Insurance can be bought upfront at the time of purchasing the report. There is typically a standard fee for this, and it explains the details of the insurance policy. The problem is if a report comes back in need of further assessment and you decide to buy insurance afterwards, you tend to find that the premiums get loaded afterwards, and so the premiums will actually be quite high. Having said that, you can always, at the end of the day, contact GroundSure's customer services team, and we are more than happy to help guide you through all of these steps. Now let's have a look at some case studies in and around the Southeast with regards to contaminated land, and hopefully you'll find quite a few of these interesting. This first case study, we're having a look at the Olympic Park in London. So Atkins oversaw the removal of pollutants and contaminants or remediation of 246 hectares of land, which had been used for industrial activity for over 200 years. The work to prepare the Olympic Park was one of the biggest land remediation projects undertaken in the UK, with a staggering £9.3 billion total remediation cost, which included the removal of 4 hectares of Japanese knotweed, which has been actually on TV quite a lot recently. It was featured on Silent Witness, if anybody saw that episode. Over 200 buildings were demolished, including offices, warehouses, chemical works, food processing facilities, concrete plants, and bus garages, and over 2 million cubic meters of soil were excavated, with around 80% of the soil reused. Contaminated soil was treated using a variety of techniques, including soil washing, bioremediation, chemical stabilization, and geotechnical stabilization. In total, 98% or 445,000 tons of demolition material were used or recycled, and this required the removal of some structures brick by brick. Some 140 archaeology pits were excavated, uncovering a 19th century boat, an 18th century roadway, Iron Age skeletons, and a Bronze Age hut. During the site investigations, 3,500 exploratory holes were dug to analyze the geological composition of the Earth. Now, a cleanup project of this size would have historically taken 5 to 15 years, and incredibly, the Olympic Park took less than 3. Now, this next case study is the former chemical works site at Sandridge in Hertfordshire. So in May 2000, the VWC, formerly known as the Three Valleys Water Company, discovered a bromate pollution at 2 of its groundwater sources abstracting from the Chalk Aquifer in Hertfordshire. The boreholes were immediately taken out of supply and an investigation initiated to determine the source of contamination. Now, samples taken from private wells and existing observation boreholes established the source to be a former chemical works at Sandridge, some 10 miles from there, where a company used to make bromide and bromate. Now, Sandridge is some 7 miles up gradient of Hatfield, and the investigation determined this contamination as possibly one of the largest contamination plumes from a point source in the UK. The plume length was some 14 miles. In June 2002, the former chemical works site at Sandridge was designated as contaminated land by St. Albans District Council under Part 2A of the EPA. Now, the chemical works site was bought by Crest Nicholson in 1983. They built 66 homes before selling it on in 1987. They were said to have carried out remediation at the time, but this was later determined inadequate, hence the giant plume. A contamination of groundwater was occurring on site. Responsibility for enforcement was passed on to the EA, who in 2005 served remediation notices on 2 appropriate persons. So Redland Minerals Limited and Crest Nicholson Residential PLC, who were deemed to be responsible for the site. In order to reduce the level of contamination, a pump and treat option was employed. The boreholes nearest the source was opened, and water was pumped out for treatment. I believe Redlands Mineral Limited and Crest Nicholson Residential PLC were required to meet the costs of the water companies in carrying out the pump and treat operation. There were a number of appeals lodged, but as far as I'm aware, the latest was refused permission in early February 2010 by the High Court. This was a major contamination event. Long-term costs and management going forward are at this stage, so I understand, still unclear. Residential land use being the most sensitive land use. About 1/3 of England's public water supply comes from aquifers like the one in Hertfordshire. I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at some of the older maps of the area. So this is a map of the site in 1958 where you can see there being works and tanks. Again, this is the same site in 1974. And then in 1988, you can see the houses crop up on the right of the top of the site. And this diagram shows the extent of the bromate plume. Now, it's pretty massive, but it is worth mentioning that the contamination shown here is below the surface of the land, so not necessarily at the surface, as it's groundwater that's been contaminated. So housing estates built on top of this area may not necessarily be contaminated, but the groundwater beneath is under remediation. So this is another little case study of a former gasworks in Slough. The site was determined as contaminated on the 29th of January 2010. So the primary school has occupied its current site off the High Street in Colnbrook since approximately 1975. Slough Borough Council identified the site as a high priority for inspection under Part 2A of the EPA, following a review of historic maps which showed Colnbrook Gasworks to have occupied the northwestern corner of the current school site from 1865 to approximately 1964. No records of the demolition of the former gasworks or any associated remediation of the site prior to the construction of the existing school are available. The potential for gasworks-related wastes to remain in the underlying soils present a significant risk of contamination, which was identified. Coincidental with a desk study assessment under Part 2A, Slough Borough Council's local education authority commissioned Terramec Limited to carry out an independent site investigation for the design of a proposed new building on the site. And during the investigation, the remains of the gas holders were encountered and visual evidence of cyanide and coal tar reported. Soil samples taken at depths between 0.3 meters below ground level and 1.4 meters below ground level revealed elevated concentrations of cyanide and hydrocarbons such as are associated with gasworks and waste. The investigations revealed elevated levels of lead, cyanide, and PAH, and a whole other host of nasty chemicals. The site has now been remediated and no longer represents a significant risk. We've got a few more case studies and then we will be done shortly. This next one is the former Broomgrove Power Station in Hastings. The power station was built on a former brickworks, and the construction was completed in 1966. It was a gas turbine power station built before the OPEC crisis. As oil-based fuels increased in price, the station was deemed uneconomic and was mothballed in 1979. By the 1980s, the turbines and other plants were either stripped from the station or stolen by scrap dealers. In 2000, there was an arson attack on 30,000 illegally dumped rubber tires within the building. The building also contained asbestos. And later in the year, the site was designated as contaminated land under Part 2A. Now, in 2001, deadly blue asbestos was discovered in a sealed underground chamber at the former power station site. The power station was demolished and remediated in 2003, however, was delayed from its original schedule as common lizards and slowworms needed to be removed from the site, which are protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. The next two case studies are a little bit closer to home. On this screen, you can see the Shoreham Chemical Works. So this site in Shoreham was formerly a chemical works, and this is where a former chemical works has led to a number of properties being designated as contaminated land, and they've had to be remediated. It's actually on the beach that I go kite surfing on. And this last one is Lennox Mews in Worthing. So this is a site in Worthing known as Lennox Mews. This site received high-profile attention and was dubbed in the media as Contaminated Land Nightmare, when low-level contamination was found to be affecting 12 properties from a filling station and MOT garage that were situated here previously. In July 2010, a solicitor acting on behalf of one of the residents selling their property flagged up the problem following a land search. Worthing Borough Housing Association brought in a consultant to test the land, and low levels of contamination were found, leaving the resident unable to sell. Worthing Borough Council subsequently confirmed that a condition in the planning consent requiring investigation and remediation of any contamination had not been observed by the developer who built the houses. As the developer has since gone into liquidation, the remediation costs have been passed to the Housing Association. And that finally brings us to the relevant environmental reports. So I'm just going to quickly go over these to have a quick idea of what they are and when to use them. So for our residential reports, we've got the home screen, the home buyers, and the estate, which all use the Ground Share Historic Land Use Database, of which you've now seen some extent of what we actually have. These three environmental reports are detailed and comprehensive in their assessment when it comes to contaminated land risk. The Home Buyers Report is the only report on the market that satisfies the Law Practice Society Note recommendations for due diligence when it comes to contaminated land and flood risk, all in one, with its inclusion of a full flood report and property-specific guidance as to whether or not the property will be seeded into flood re or the flood reinsurance scheme. The home screen is just a quick step down from the home buyers, still covering contaminated land in full, but without the inclusion of a full flood report. It's just got a flood screen. Whilst the estate is used for larger properties such as stately homes with large gardens, which also have a comprehensive contaminated land assessment and a flood screen. I'm not quite sure if many of you do any commercial reports, but we do have 3 commercial reports that cover contaminated land. And these are fully comprehensive when it comes to their assessment of contaminated land risk, with the screening report being more appropriate for lower value commercial transactions and portfolios, and for those who only want a flood screen versus a full flood report. The review, just like our home buyers in residential, is a fully comprehensive commercial report, which also includes a full flood report. It's recommended for high-value property transactions and for any properties going under redevelopment. And lastly, the agricultural report is meant for transactions of agricultural land that's going to stay in agricultural use, with farm-specific guidance and assessments, taking into account things like land classifications, topography, countryside stewardship schemes, and intensive farming. And so that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you again for giving me your time. I would really appreciate it if you take a few seconds to fill out the feedback questions at the end of this webinar, as we're always looking at ways to improve. Should you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit us online or to drop us an email. And many thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful week.